may be thinking policy is a very dry topic, but I've noted that every speaker so far mentioned policy, and just want to say why policy is important if you haven't gleaned it already, because it's not just a bunch of bureaucrats and regulators in the basements of old executive and legislative office buildings, although it is that too. Policy is important, especially in this area, because it will shape what the psychedelic community will look like going forward. It asks questions and answers questions. So how inclusive will the psychedelic space be? Will it include indigenous? Will it include marginalized people? Will it include environmental regeneration considerations? Will it only be a medicalized space? And critically, will the psychedelic community consist of extractive role models that we have in so many other areas that look only to concentrate power and opportunity in the hands of the few? And I'm very, very honored to be here. My name is Donna Burns, and I'm a director on the board of directors of the Mckenna Academy of Natural Philosophy, your host, and we have just wonderful speakers to this very important topic. So you have full bios available on the website, so I'm going to give very short introductions and let the speakers really put their messages across. By Zoom, joining us today by Zoom is Carey Turnbull, who is the chair of the advisory board of the NYU Center for Psychedelic Medicine. He is the president of the Heffter Research Institute. He's the founder of Ceruvia Life Sciences, and I believe, as Dennis mentioned also, he runs an organization called The Right to Operate. And after Carey, we have Professor David Nutt, who's here with us. He is a psychiatrist and a professor of neuropsychopharmacology at the Imperial College of London. He's written 35 books, over 1,000 articles, and rather than go through the detail, it's fair to say he is a pioneer in psychedelic research here in Britain, and will speak to us also about international policies for psychedelics. So he covers the whole world. I guess Carey covers the States, and David gets the rest of the world. So it is really my pleasure. My pleasure and honor to introduce them. Thank you so much, Carey.
Okay, I hope your audio is better than mine. I really got the idea that I was introduced there. Thank you very much. So this is one of my great honors. I'm now the president of Heffter. Heffter, the organization that Dennis started, I'm going to say 30 years ago. And I'm going to assume everything is going well with the technology here and just keep going through it. So as you've been looking at, there are three primary ways to achieve legal, safe access to psychedelic plants, drugs, and experiences. These are the right to religious freedom, ballot initiatives, and the FDA path to prescription medicine status. None of them are easy, quick, or inexpensive. The FDA regulatory path requires rescheduling, and one of the primary definitions of Schedule 1 is no known medical benefit. The long and expensive endeavor of proving a medical benefit typically begins with academic research and leads eventually to the much more time-consuming and much more expensive path of commercial research to prove safety and efficacy to the satisfaction of the regulator. Just as a rising tide lifts all ships, the three paths should, in an ideal case, complement each other. A current topic of discussion has become the opportunity and the attendant complication created by regulatory awards of monopoly. Typically, we attempt to prohibit monopolies in our economic system. Think big oil in the early 20th century. They tried to break up big oil and did so successfully because monopolies are not in the public interest. Think big tech in the present era, where there's concern if they have too much market share, too much market power, and represent monopolies, it should be broken up. There are exceptions to that rule of prohibiting monopolies, and they're very rare. One, for instance, is the electricity business. Electricity business, it's assumed that it's in the public's interest to have a single electricity provider, one set of wires, one power generating station. And when they award an electricity business a monopoly, they're controlled by the Public Utility Commission. And that means that every 6 months, they have to go to the commission and say, here's our costs, fuel, we have a generating station, we maintain wires, here's our costs. And the Public Utility Commission adjusts your electricity rate on a quarterly or biannual basis based upon cost. So it's a cost plus. They're given monopoly, but they're carefully controlled. So there's one example. Another example would be the pharma industry. Again, unusual, but they sometimes make awards of monopoly. And there are 3 levels to the pharma trade. On the top level, regulations encourage the formation of capital pools to employ in the risky and expensive search for novel cures for debilitating illnesses. They encourage that by awarding exclusivity for a limited number of years to firms that succeed. No harm and no foul there. There's some tension around cost, and we don't, in America, want to have to go to Canada or Mexico to get our meds. Hence, the second level comes 10 or so years later when that award for a novel invention runs out of monopoly protection, and generic firms compete to be the high-quality, low-cost provider. These firms can also be billion-dollar publicly traded firms. Again, not necessarily any harm or foul there. They're ending the monopoly of that's been awarded. The third level in the pharma trade is represented by, for instance, the Gates Foundation. In the 1950s, a vaccine for polio was invented. Originally, there was an award of a monopoly award, and they received money back for the work they had done to invent that. Polio was eradicated in the developed world. 50 years later, the Gates Foundation recognizes there are still deep pockets. There are still pockets of polio in Pakistan and Africa, small pockets, and they begin to give the vaccine away free. So psilocybin should be somewhere between levels 2 and 3. Firms can aspire to be a generic provider, or like Usona, give it away free. Usona was started by one of Dennis and I's former or fellow board members at Heffter to take psilocybin for depression through the FDA process. So I started a business, an organization called Freedom to Operate. Freedom to Operate is a term of art in the field of intellectual property law and refers to the ability to develop, make, and market products without legal liabilities to third parties who claim intellectual property rights in those products. It was formed primarily for the advancement of science and education, specifically to support and facilitate science research in the public interest and for the public benefit. Freedom to Operate, or FTO, expects that its primary method for doing so will be to challenge certain patent rights which are improperly claimed and which, therefore, inappropriately prevent other individuals and organizations from engaging in research and innovation in the public interest and for the public benefit. And again, freedom to operate is a term of art in intellectual property law, refers to the ability to develop, make, and market products without legal liabilities to third parties who claim intellectual property rights in those products. There's an important public policy interest in validating bad patents, those which were mistakenly issued by, for instance, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and promoting free competition that does not infringe on validly granted patents and other intellectual property. Issued patents are presumed valid and so operate to discourage investment by others into the same or similar subject matter. The public's benefited when potentially incorrect issued patents are challenged. There's a strong federal policy favoring free competition in ideas, which do not merit patent protection. And certain other laws, the Leahy-Smith law in America, done in 2011, created an inter-party review and post-grant review proceedings that permit third parties to challenge the validity of issued patents without first being accused of infringement. So I want to give a couple of examples. And first, we should talk about the difference between intellectual property and tangible or real property. Real property, the best example, tangible property you can hold in your hand, real estate, best example. You can stand on it, you can build a house on it, and it's known as real estate because it's the real part of your personal estate, of your personal property. Then there's intellectual property. Intellectual property can't be held in the hand. And so one of the best examples I can give here, and I will give two examples now of intellectual property and how it can be used or misused. So I'll start with the example of Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney, a member of the Beatles, he wrote a song, and it was Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Probably most of you are familiar with it. And those are registered at places like ASCAP. ASCAP is the American Society for Composers, Authors, and Publishers. So Paul McCartney, having written Boat on a, say I see a man in a boat on a river, he sort of sings the tune, goes over to ASCAP, he says, I wrote this song. They say, great, and Paul McCartney has the rights to the song that he wrote. If someone else came along later and they said, hey, I wrote a great song, it's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and here's how it goes, and he hummed the tune, you gave him a bar or two. If that person wasn't a Beatles fan, they would probably at ASCAP stamp say, great, that's your tune. What's got to happen at that point is that when Paul McCartney hears about that, he's got to go to ASCAP and say, hey, that's prior art. I actually wrote that tune quite some time ago. And then he may have to go to some lengths to prove that, show an example of his singing song beforehand. So there's one example of intellectual property and the use and misuse of intellectual property laws. So a second example of use and misuse of intellectual property laws, at some time ago, all of us, I assume, became aware that someone had filed a patent on psilocybin. And an intellectual property attorney brought that to my attention. He said, someone filed a patent on psilocybin. The name of the patent is Psilocybin, Methods of Manufacture, Polymorphs, and Uses. Now, when you file a patent, you're given usually a year or so when that's the contents behind the title are kept secret, and it's to give the patent holder, who is, in all best cases, invented something new, sort of a year and a half head start with their own invention. So we had to wait a year or so, and I thought the likelihood of this actually being what it says is rather slim. Probably somebody took some little nit, made some little improvement, and they want to say that improvement is something that I'm adding to the party. And when it came out, however, it did appear that they were attempting to patent psilocybin, its methods of manufacture, its polymorphs, and its uses. So what I would like to do at this point is share a screen. And so to do that, let's see, do I have, I'm going to share a screen here, and you'll have to assure me that this actually works. So if I go here, are you now seeing the patent cooperation? Great, thank you for the assurance. It's like when you're in a cell phone and you say, are you still there? Are you still there? You'll have to assure me as I put the documents up one at a time. So this is the Patent Cooperation Treaty. It's the International Searching Authority, written opinion of the International Searching Authority on that patent, psilocybin, methods of manufacture, polymorphs, and uses. And so breezing through the form, I'll get to the important parts. Here we have inventive step. No, there were no inventive steps. And then they give a little bit more detail, more of their written opinion. They say, actually, we looked this up, and Paul McCartney of the Beatles wrote Lucy in the Sky and Diamonds. In this particular case, Albert Hofmann at Sandoz in 1965, 62, and even going back into the 1950s, was the first person to isolate the psychoactive molecule in the psilocybin mushroom. It had been brought back from Mexico by Gordon Wasson. Gordon had given it to a few people to try to see how could this possibly be creating this experience. And after somebody must have put two and two together and say, this seems kind of like that LSD stuff that they're passing around. And although no one could isolate, chemistry is actually, science is actually a century-old chemistry. It's sort of it's a rather recent thing, but they sent it to Sandoz. He was able to isolate the psychoactive molecule and show how to make it on a lab bench. And when you make psilocybin on a lab bench, you end up with a beaker full of solution. And whether you're Sasha Shulgin or Albert Hofmann and you've discovered the way to do that, you're left with the do is you dry that. You dry it carefully, slowly, very controlled conditions, and you end up with a powder, and that powder takes the form of a salt, and that salt is called a polymorph. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a scientist, and so I had no idea what a polymorph was. I had to go and ask about this, and so the easiest way to understand this, as I got my best education in kindergarten, like most of us, and in kindergarten we're told that when a raindrop freezes into a snowflake, snowflakes, they take an infinite number of patterns. Every snowflake is different. I think that's probably a child's tale. I doubt that there are that many, but when you take a solution of a simple molecule made in a beaker and you dry it, you end up with a powder, and it ends up in a salt form of a pattern. Typically, there are less than a half dozen, 1, 2, 3, 5, maybe forms that they can take. And it's a very structured pattern. So that's what a polymorph is. So what happened with this patent was, because of this, and I'm going to stop sharing a screen. I should go away from that. So when you look for a patent, you venue shop. It's much like if you're in the United States, if you're a black person accused of a crime, you're in an all-white county, your attorney tries to venue shop. He says, I don't get a fair trial here. I want to go to a place where I can get a more fair trial. Well, patent attorneys do the exact opposite. They go to a place where it's going to be easy to get their patent. If you go to South Africa, South Africa's policy is any patent that is asked for is stamped approved, and they assume you're going to fight it out in court if it's not legitimate. They do a little bit more searching in Europe, but apparently the firm looking for that patent was Compass. They got it stamped, approved. Freedom to Operate made some observations about that to the patent office, and it got narrowed to the polymorph claim. And the polymorph claim, because you can imagine that if someone said, I'm going to patent insulin, Merck or whoever owns the patent and makes billions of dollars a year would immediately say, we're going to invalidate that patent. I assume the idea here was the people in the patent office have never heard the word psilocybin. We can get this stamped. I'm not saying they were being clever, but they were being utilitarian. And now we have the problem of who's going to complain about that. So looking at the idea that the last element standing here, because the patent court, the patent jurisdiction largely said this thing of the polymorph seems to be unique. The rest of it they recognized was not unique, but they said the polymorph claim seems to have some teeth in it. So my patent attorney, I said, but what would we do about that? Because I don't know, is that a novel polymorph or is it not? And he said, well, the way to find that out is let's get a sample of psilocybin that predated their patent when they said to have invented this polymorph. So to do that, and it has to be psilocybin with a forensic trail, because you're going to be looking at registering your findings in a legal proceeding. So we asked the places that would have psilocybin, the universities that have been researching it for some time. Largely, those are people who have had a long relationship with Heffter, who did the work on academic work on psilocybin. And I'll throw Dennis and the other people who founded Heffter long ago. They did so to revive the reputation of the word psychedelic. And so they had supported research at these universities. We got psilocybin samples from, I'm going to say, a dozen or so universities. We also got a sample from the National Institute of Drug Abuse and the DEA. They have a reference sample so that when someone's caught with a powder and they want to say which illegal scheduled powder was this, they can find out. We also reached out through various channels to Sandoz, who still had their 1963, a bottle of their 1963 issue psilocybin. So we ended up with about a dozen samples of psilocybin with a forensic trail that predated the patent. And so at that point, we needed to get to know a little bit more about how to test them. Now, as we've been looking for these samples, we looked at universities in the United States and in Europe. It's a Schedule I drug, so the maker has a Schedule I license, and it gets shipped to the university, which has to get a Schedule I license and a DEA license. So it's a clear forensic trail. The one we ended up using was made by Dave Nichols, a storied psychopharmacologist, one of the world's experts on the psychopharmacology of psychedelics, and founding member of Heffter. It was made by Dave with his DEA license. It had been shipped to Johns Hopkins, used by Roland Griffiths in research for predating the patent that had been issued. So now we have a forensic trail. Now we've got to look at what this is. One of the people we bumped into when in looking for this is a researcher in Scandinavia who said, because as we began to look into the polymorph, chemists told us this is a very rarefied corner of chemistry. And actually, the chemists we talked to said you need to find a physical chemist. And the physical chemist said this spins beyond, it gets more rarefied. You need a crystallographer, someone who knows about the crystallography of how these simple molecules form themselves into salt patterns. And so one of the fellows in Scandinavia said, actually, I have a friend, I know a guy, and he is the chair of the Nobel Prize Chemistry Committee. And so that seemed unimpeachable. And when you get in front of a patent court, you get into a situation where it's he said, she said. My guy says it's unique. My guy says it's not. So we felt the chair of the Nobel Prize Chemistry Committee, that was going to be, at that point you need to be, because this is so complicated that not only wouldn't the patent officer understand it, whoever's adjudicating the procedure will actually not be able to understand what we're beginning to deal with here. So at this point, let me share a screen again, and I will show the, hopefully this will work. Are you now looking at the psilocybin crystal structure paper? Are you now looking at the psilocybin crystal structure? Yeah. Great, thank you very much. So psilocybin, so the paper that we developed, we were looking for evidence you could put into a court, and we thought, what better evidence than a peer-reviewed paper? And those of you who are scientists who know that, because rather than getting one guy's expert testimony says, yes, it is, and the other guy's expert testimony says, no, it's not, and you're talking to someone adjudicating the procedure who is not a chemist, nor a physical chemist, nor a crystallographer. And crystallographers, you could probably count on your hand. This particular peer-reviewed journal probably has a publication list of about 1,000, but they're the world's experts in this sort of stuff. So here we have the paper, and I'll, when I read papers, not being an academic, papers or books, I read the opening paragraph and the final paragraph, and I feel like that tells me everything I need to know. In between is way too much detail. So I'm going to go through the first paragraph. There's psilocybin. It's a tryptamine, a natural product found in numerous species of fungi known for their psychoactive properties. Following its structural elucidation and chemical synthesis in 1959, purified synthetic psilocybin has been evaluated in clinical trials and shown promise in the treatment of various mental health disorders. In a recent process scale crystallization investigation, 3 crystalline forms of psilocybin, 3 polymorphs of psilocybin, for the 2 anhydrates, polymorphs A and B. And I'll skip the big words that I don't understand. Utilizing the 3 solved structures, an investigation was conducted based on quantitative analysis and X-ray pattern diffraction. So molecules that I came to know, no human being has ever seen a molecule. When you see Sasha showing you these pictures, and he calls them dirty little pictures because they are the representation of a molecule that is illegal. So he humorously called those his dirty little pictures. But any chemist that's making a picture of what a molecule is, and you'll see them, it's little red and yellow balls with a white stick between them, showing how the various atoms have joined together into a molecule. Well, those are represented notionally because no human being has ever seen a molecule, because a molecule is smaller than a wavelength of light. And so the human eye will never be able to see, there's no such thing as magnifying it to a point where the human eye can see one. So they use what's called powder X-ray diffraction. They take the salt and they shoot X-rays through it, and they come up with is not a picture. They have a pattern provided by different sources of both psilocybin produced between 1963 and 2021, and this was our work. We had these 6 samples. Over the last 57 years, each of these samples quantitatively reflect one or more of the hydrate and anhydrate polymorphs. That means with water in them or entirely dry. I've come to know a few big words. In addition to the quantitatively evaluating the composition of each sample, this article evaluates correlations between the crystal forms present, corresponding process methods, methods of manufacture, sample age, and storage conditions. Furthermore, revision is recommended. Now, notice this is not a court filing, this is an academic peer-reviewed paper by crystallographers. Furthermore, revision is recommended on characterizations in recently granted patents that include descriptions of crystalline psilocybin inappropriately reported as single-phase isostructural variant. Rate-fold refinement demonstrated the claimed material was composed of approximately 81% polymorph A and 19% of polymorph B, both of which have been identified in historical samples. In this article, we show conclusively that all published data can be explained in terms of three well-defined forms, meaning polymorphs, of psilocybin, and that no additional forms are needed to explain the diffraction pattern. So again, it goes on, psilocybin is a psychedelic natural product found in numerous mushrooms around the world. Various species of mushrooms have been used by humans for thousands of years, especially by people in Mesoamerica to occasion spiritual or mystical experience. It was first isolated from psilocybin mushrooms, characterized and later synthesized by Paul McCartney of the Beatles, Albert Hoffman at Sandoz in 1959. In the 1960s and 70s, Sandoz distributed bulk psilocybin in tablets under the name Indocybin to researchers and clinicians worldwide, with renewed and increased interest in the scientific and clinical study of psychedelics. Psilocybin's been evaluated in modern clinical trials aimed at understanding its safety and efficacy in treating a range of mental health conditions, including depression, which was the one they claimed in their patent by Roland Griffiths and others. Roland, another really wonderful member of the Heffter board, Heffter, which Dennis so long ago was instrumental in helping to form. So there's that document. I'm going to now let's see if I can share another document. I'm going to see it. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And now I'm going to share screen again. This is the only way I can figure to get between these things. So let's see what the next paper is. Let me go to my Finder here. Here we go. So I guess the next thing I will show is, this is the show and tell here. I'll see if I can do this. And I will, let's see, I'm going to go back to share screen. Where do we have, there I am on Zoom. I share screen and I show this one. This just fascinates me. You're looking at the Argonne National Laboratory. Great. So Sven Leiden, you can't get into these things. These things cost billions of dollars to make. There are sort of 3 or 4 of them in the world. I'm sure that the Soviet Union, Russia has one. There's one in CERN. These are particle accelerators the size of 5 football fields. There's one out by Berkeley in California. We have, I think, 3 of them in the United States. This one is the Argonne National Laboratory. It's outside Chicago, outside the University of Chicago. Because Sven Leiden, who's on the committee, the Nobel Prize Chemistry Committee, he said the old-fashioned way to do this was by using these X-ray pattern diffraction thing. The modern way to do it, or the new way to do it, is by using the Activated Materials Laboratory is a radiological facility located at Argonne's Advanced Photon Source, adjacent to the high-energy X-ray microscopy beamline on the long beamline building constructed under the design and operation is funded by the Department of Energy, and it assists the nuclear community in examining radioactive samples at the high-energy X-ray microscope, see the word microscope, and other beamlines of the Advanced Photon Source. It was developed to facilitate the safe conduct of experiments on activated materials. It provides sample access and flexible operation, et cetera. So actually the modern way to look at what a polymorph is to run them through one of these things. And so I think the next thing we should do is if the people there can show a short clip of Sven Leiden, who, when we got the sample, when we looked to the universities for the sample, this is a researcher at a university in Europe, said to us, I know this guy, and I think he can get an even better, more definitive picture of the molecule. And I have not been able to figure out whether Sven Leiden, he lit up with the idea that we would take psilocybin molecule or psilocybin polymorph and put it in here and definitively identify the shape of the polymorph, which no human eye has ever seen, in which X-ray pattern diffraction can identify, but not as well as it can be identified by this method. And I'm not sure to this day whether he lit up because he's a psychonaut or because he's a science geek. And here were some people coming to him saying, you can get time on this machine, but you have to have good reason. And you can't really pay your way onto these machines. And we weren't really sure if we were saying, we're going to support this enormous piece of research. Sven was one of the authors on the paper that I just showed you, but he did light up. And so now if we can go ahead and show this 3-minute clip or 2-minute, 24-second clip of Sven Leiden, if you can go ahead and do that.
Sven Leiden, you are the chairman of the Nobel Committee in Chemistry that just have awarded 3 Nobel laureates who have developed a new super resolution microscope. Can you tell us what super resolution is? How big or how small is it?
Well, the super resolution refers to Abbe's limit, which states that a microscope can never be give a better resolution than half the wavelength of the light used. And the methods that has been developed by this year's laureates shows that this limit is not strictly enforced. Actually, it can be not only broken but superseded to any resolution. It's not applicable to any system. It means that we need to do some alterations to the system. First of all, we need to make them fluorescent. But if that is possible, the physical limit is much, much further down, which means we can study much, much smaller objects. And this turns microscopy into a chemical technique, while it used to be a biological technique.
So what new worlds can you see with this new microscope?
Well, I think the easiest way to look at it is to think back to when microscopes were first used. So the first images that were drawn from microscopes, that started microbiology. Now, what is happening now is that because we can see individual macromolecules moving about in a living cell, we can study chemistry at a single molecule level and in real life. And this is very, very important to chemistry because chemistry has traditionally been about studying a large number of molecules and the effect that they have. Here we can look at a single molecule as it is active in a chemical system. That means that rare events can be studied in a very different way. Reactions can be studied as they happen, not as the end result, but actually as they take place. It opens entirely new possibilities for chemistry and for biochemistry.
So this is like...
Okay, yes, I'll come back in. So when we that was Sven Leiden. He was one of the people working this paper. I think I'll share a screen and go back to let's see, share screen, and I'm going to go back to the crystallography paper. So you're seeing the crystallography paper again? Okay, great. As I say, I read the first paragraph and the last paragraph. I read you the first paragraph there. I'm flipping down through the paper. Even these, so X-ray pattern diffraction, this is what it looks like when you do X-ray pattern diffraction and you see what peaks there are in a polymorph to identify the polymorph. It's a graphical representation. Some of us are more familiar with the pictures that, as I say, no human being has ever seen a molecule. They represent them once they figure out what they are. And this is not a molecule, this is molecules in a pattern. This is a polymorph. This is how they structurally put themselves into a pattern. Again, think a raindrop becoming a snowflake, And so psilocybin takes on 2 or 3 different patterns. The science in here is way above my head. Here again are polymorphs and they're forming. The people who did this work are highly credentialed, as one might guess. I'm going to get down to, as I say, you know, they're all of this. The reason we wanted this in a peer-reviewed journal is because trying to explain this to anyone, it's going to be above their head. And again, it's going to be sort of he said, she said. So we had the powder X-ray diffraction and also the work done on the synchrotron at Argonne National Laboratory. And basically this paper written by the chair of the Nobel Prize Committee. And the conclusion, structure determination, refinement for laboratory and synchrotron, that's the Argonne National Lab atom smasher patterns, was accomplished in 2 anhydrous, meaning dry, no waters in them, crystalline forms of psilocybin, commonly encountered in the API process development. The new structure solutions add to 3 previously solved forms of psilocybin. Phase estimation of different forms in bulk psilocybin was accomplished using the Rietveld method. I don't know what that is, but it's very impressive to whoever does. The analysis indicated the 3 most commonly encountered crystalline forms of psilocybin obtained from routine synthesis were a trihydrate, meaning there was water in it, and an anhydrate, meaning no water in it, and a second anhydrate, polymorph B. And that 1 or more of the 3 phases were identified in all 24 psilocybin samples evaluated. These are ones from the forensic trail that we'd gotten from Sandoz themselves, from the National Institute of Drug Use and the DEA, and from a dozen or so universities who have been studying psilocybin for decades, which were produced between 1963 and 1921. Recent analysis on older samples of psilocybin often revealed hydrate A due to hydroscopy and interconversion, while more recently produced samples, as well as in older samples stored under controlled humidity, were found to contain primarily polymorph A with variable low-level amounts of polymorph B and hydrate. If you store this stuff for 30 years and it's perfectly dry, a couple of molecules of H2O water are going to find their way in there, and so the polymorph begins to look a little different. So there are hydrate and anhydrate. They have a little water in them and they don't. When they're first made, no water in them. This article provides insight on the crystalline behavior of psilocybin produced under conditions typical. Finally, PXRD and phase analysis of historical samples offers confidence that the 3 most pharmaceutically relevant crystalline forms of psilocybin have been created and observed repeatedly and consistently since 1959, when the first synthesis of psilocybin was reported, and acknowledgments the advanced photon source of Argonne National Laboratory. I think this gets unimpeachable myself. It's way over my head. We gratefully acknowledge the National Institute of Drug Abuse Supply Program, as NIDA, for a sample, for supplying psilocybin sample 1. Paul Daly, who works at the Shulgin lab in California with the at this point curating what they have in there. He provided a sample out of Sasha Shulgin's lab. Roland Guffus and Dave Nichols providing sample 4, which is the one we sent to Argonne, et cetera, and Freedom to Operate provided seminal administrative and financial support for the project. Finally, we thank Bob Jesse, who formed Council for Spiritual Practices long ago, for studying psilocybin, and Sven Leiden, the chair of the Nobel Prize Chemistry Committee, for their insightful help in the preparation of the manuscript. So I will stop sharing for a moment there. So it was a real nail biter when we did this, because we wanted to have a peer-reviewed journal so that we can say to the adjudicating facility, this isn't our opinion and somebody else's opinion. This is the opinion of the chair of the Nobel Prize Chemistry Committee. You have to get into credential versus credential rather than data versus data, because this is above the heads of the people who are adjudicating about it. And those of you who are scientists know, the right to publish is enormous. And the academics who had helped us write this paper, they were, of course, their primary interest was getting it published in the peer-reviewed journal, because their careers, God bless them, are all about getting published in peer-reviewed journals. And we had a deadline to make our filing at the patent office. You have 6 months to comment in this post-grant review process. And so But the academics didn't want to do that before it was accepted for publication by the Crystallography Journal, which they don't control. They submitted it to the Crystallography Journal. It goes out for peer review. Other crystallographers, and God knows how many of them there are in the world, but very few, they all beat up on the thing and make their comments and get it improved or not. And so it finally was accepted for publication by the Crystallography Journal, the world's premier crystallography journal, which has again, a circulation of a few thousand. It was accepted by them 3 days before the deadline for filing at the patent office. So we incorporated the document into the patent office and filed it, just so that none of you are under the illusion that that's the end of the story. You would expect me, that this was $1 million plus event, and funding from myself and my wife, from Bill Linton, who was a board member at Heffter and who had formed USONA, Evolve Foundation, which has become a big supporter of psychedelic work, the Stephen Alexander Cohen Foundation, which have become enormous supporters of work on psychedelics, have all helped to fund the project. And you would have thought when we did this, we'd have heard, oh my God, I'm so sorry I caused you all this time and expense. But you've got a $200 million machine coming at you here, and the machine, it's a corporation, and it's gathered capital based upon the bald-faced promise. We have patents, we have exclusivity. We will have an award of a monopoly award based on our patents, and we will be able to make a fortune on this. So so that no one is under any misunderstanding, it's ongoing. We were approached by, you can see the movie scene, and everything is done virtually these days. Nobody shows up anywhere, but you can imagine 4 guys in navy suit boots, white shirt, red tie, each with their own briefcase, sitting down at a table and facing you. And that's so it's still into, and my own version of the response was, no, it's not. It's like, yes, it is. No, it's not. I don't want to get sarcastic here, but that's sort of where we stand at the moment. It's ongoing. We do hope, though, that, as again, I said, freedom to operate, what it wants to do is important public policy interest in invalidating bad patents, those which were mistakenly issued by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, promoting free competition, does not infringe on validly granted patents or on their intellectual property rights, and gives us the ability. I'm not opposed to big pharma and awards of monopoly because they're encouraging the formation of capital pools to do what's necessary to find cures for previously incurable diseases or illnesses. Here we're not shooting in the dark. Psilocybin has been known for many, many, many decades to how to make it, methods. So psilocybin, its methods of manufacture. Now, yes, its polymorphs and its uses have been known for decades. It doesn't mean that generic manufacturers won't make fortunes competing to be the high quality, low cost provider of psilocybin to the human race. Fortunes will be made, manufacture, distribution, provision of care. These are all big businesses. Having said that, let me transit to 2 other things that spin outside. I've given us 2 examples of intellectual property rights. One being, Paul McCartney and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. The other, this affair over the potential to or not to patent psilocybin. Let me share a screen. We're 2 other things now. So I'm going to go to share screen, and these would be things that move outside of this problem of patents. So where am I going to find this? Here. So now, how do I share that? I'm going to stop sharing. So I got to stop sharing and start sharing. So let me go back to here, and I again go to share screen. Sorry, I'm not a little better at this. I'm sure other people would seamlessly run their way through these things. So are you now seeing the FDA letter? Great. So I've got 2 more documents here, and thank you for giving me a time check. So this is one, and I will, as usual, read the first paragraph and not bore us with any more than that because it's too thick. So this is the U.S. Food and Drug Administration writing to the USPTO. And so And so they write, so I write pursuant to executive order so-and-so in the hope of furthering developing the FDA's engagement with the USPTO to help ensure that the patent system, while incentivizing innovation, does not also unjustifiably delay generic drug and biosimilar competition beyond that reasonably contemplated by applicable law. This executive order instructs the Secretary of Health and Human Services through the Commissioner of the FDA to write a letter to the Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property and Director of the USPTO, enumerating and describing any relevant concerns with the FDA, bringing more drug competition to the market and addressing the high cost of medicines by improving access to affordable medicine is a top priority of the administration, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the FDA. FDA does not have a direct role in how drugs are priced. However, we play an indirect role in holding down prices by bringing efficiency to drug development and review process and promoting robust competition for established drugs. So that's as far as I'll go with that. I mean, let me stop sharing and show you that. And this, by the way, has nothing to do with psychedelics. This is just big pharma. And big pharma has been given the right to monopolies, but we know that monopolies are very unusual in our system. And so here's the FDA and US Patent Office attempting to get involved in big pharma in general and the tendency to patent. I'll show you one more document, and that has to do specifically with psychedelics and this bigger subject. So let me go back to share screen and let me go to my Finder, Harvard Law on Patents. So are you seeing patents on psychedelics? Oh, so I've got to go back. I'm going to stop sharing. Let me see if I can now, again, start share screen. And I want to go to, which screen here? Here we go. Now are you looking at? So this relates to the paper we just saw between the FDA and the USPTO saying, how can we work with the pharmaceutical industry to encourage competition? This particular paper was written, and again, since I'm not an attorney and these things are above my head also, I point out who wrote this, but I'll start here. So in the past 2 decades, pioneering researchers rekindled interest in the therapeutic use of psychedelic substances, such as psilocybin, ibogaine, DMT. Indigenous communities have used them for centuries, and researchers have studied them in the 1950s and 60s. However, most psychedelics were banned in the 1970s when President Nixon launched the US war on drugs. 50 years later, rising rates of mental illness, substance abuse, and suicide are prompting researchers to revisit psychedelics, and some have gained permission to study them in limited quantities. Clinical trials are producing promising results, creating enthusiasm for commercializing and patenting psychedelics. This essay analyzes the ethical, legal, and social implications of patenting these controversial substances. Patents on psychedelics raise unique concerns associated with their unusual qualities, history, and regulation. Because they were criminalized for decades, the US Patent and Trademark Office lacks personnel with expertise in the field, rendering more questionable the quality of its evaluation of psychedelic patents. Moreover, because indigenous communities pioneered many aspects of modern psychedelic therapies, their patenting by Western corporations may promote biopiracy, the exploitation of indigenous knowledge without compensation. Importantly, control of psychedelics by a small number of companies may stifle innovation and reduce access to these therapies. The essay presents proposals to reduce the risk of biopiracy and the issuance of unwarranted psychedelic patents. Potential solutions include the implementation of psychedelic patent pledges, the creation of psychedelic prior art repositories, and the tightening of patentability requirements for novel drug therapies. The essay concludes that ultimately, due to their importance to the advancement of science and public health, it may be appropriate to view psychedelics as tools of scientific discovery, eligible only for a limited patent protection. And all I'll do now is point out that this was written by bioethics law professors at Harvard Law School, excuse me, and what do we have down here, Yale Law School, So it's Harvard Law School, and if you can read faster than me in here, yeah, it says Yale Law School somewhere in there. We also thank Jack Green, who was FTO's patent attorney, Shayla Love, who wrote for Vice on this subject, Graham Petchnick, who writes on this subject often, etc. So I say again, well written, and I won't bore you with, this goes on for that many pages also. We just don't have the time. So just conclusion, the issuance of low quality patents on psychedelics reflects unique characteristics of these substances, their complex history and regulation, and systemic problems with the patent system. Though prior art repositories and patent pledges can be helpful, meaningful patent reform is necessary to prevent the granting of meritless psychedelic patents. The existing patent framework often rewards those who patent Me Too drugs that are insignificant advancements over existing therapies, reducing public benefit received per research dollar spent. Copycat therapeutics not only lack novelty, but they have also failed to produce significant improvements in mental health care, as evidenced by rising rates of suicide and skyrocketing overdose deaths. Drug companies have recently applied this Me Too approach to psychedelic experiences pioneered and revered by indigenous community. And so it's not only drug making, but psychedelic experiences. Psychedelics may represent a paradigm shift for mental health care and the most promising solution to the mental health crisis. However, as a small number of companies secure wide swaths of intellectual property early on, the beneficial impact of that shift may be blunted. In this essay, we've set out a series of proposals for discouraging unwarranted patents in the psychedelics field, some radical, some less so. It's essential to have these conversations now while the industry remains in its nascent stage. The political economy is such that once new players become large enough, they will have an outsized influence over potential changes to the law, especially those that threaten their dominant positions. So with that, I will stop it. So yeah, that is the end. So I think at this point you're inviting questions. I've been careful to say that I've hired experts, legal and scientific. So I hope I'm able to answer your questions. I may or may not be able to answer any questions, but I welcome someone asking them.
Hold tight, we're coming your way.
Hi there. I was wondering if you have any relationship or are aware of Porta Sophia, which is working on preventing bad patents. Are you supporting their efforts?
I do. One share screen that I opted out of here, but in answer to that question, thank you. You give me a chance to go back to share screen. And I'm now going to share Porta Sophia's website, which let's see now. I'm gonna fumble around trying to find it because I sort of went away from that. So let me go back to my, how do I close that window? Yeah, yes. Great. Well, so Porta Sophia, yes. Bill Linton, old board member of Heffter and the founder of USONA, has put quite a bit of effort into Porta Sophia. It's a site that is attempting to give patent officials a place to go to reference prior art. So it's prior art on psychedelics over the last 50, 60 years, research that's been done. It mentions the subjects of biopiracy and indigenous use. But of course, when you're a patent office and you're looking for other prior art, you're looking for published material. And so Porta Sophia, yes, thank you very much for mentioning that. It's a website, and it's becoming very robust repository of information about this sort of about this. And it's a fixed number, is about 1,200 patent officers that work for the USPTO in the United States. And you can actually address them all. If you're a patent attorney, you know how to work your way through these complex federal systems. And so they will be letting all 1,200 patent attorneys know that when they see a patent on psychedelics cross their desk, none of them are experts in psychedelics, they can refer to Porta Sophia. Porta Sophia means a port or an entrance to Sophia, to wisdom. So yes, Porta Sophia, thank you very much for mentioning it.
Anybody else have one last question? Okay. Just have time for one more.
Carey, first off, thank you for leading the charge and being a trailblazer on this issue. Two questions. What happens if you're not successful, or if this is not successful at the patent office? What's the implication? What's the implication?
Well, so successful or not, and thank you for asking that. This is where, it sounded so triumphant. We've got this paper, and now we put that into our, submission to the U.S. Patent Office. And so where does it go from there? I asked my patent attorney, and my patent attorney told me what others have, which is that when a drug, we're in a situation not unlike when a drug has been brought to market by someone and they have patent protection and monopoly. They fight like tooth and nail when somebody says, I'm going to begin to make your generic version for 1/10 what you're selling your patent protected version. The battle when monopoly becomes a generic drug, they are epic. And so we have two choices here. One is to leave that sit there and wait until someone does. And in the near future, there will be several firms that that go through the process of FDA rescheduling and have the right to manufacture and distribute psilocybin. We can either wait until that happens and see at that point, does someone who has a patent attempt to enforce it? And we now have a sufficient body of information that can be referenced back to, or do we continue now? And we're continuing on. We're, at this point to try to invalidate the patent. But at a certain point, we have to think, let's wait till somebody has some other generic manufacturer has a sufficient pocket. Believe me, this pocket is run dry, but we do have other pockets that are involved here. The Cohen Foundation, wonderful, and Stephen Alexander Cohen Foundation. It's a very deep pocket that's helping us here. So so what will happen? What we hope does not happen, and the reason we've taken this $1 million, I say to people who have helped us with this, with the funding, that the return on investment, which is what someone looks for in investment. The return on investment will be enormous, because if we save the human race $1 billion from someone patenting something that's in the public domain and then ransoming it back to the human race in the form of a protected price, we could probably save the human race $1 billion by having spent $1 million. That's 1,000 to 1 return on investment. So this isn't a fundraising opportunity, but the people funding into this realize this is a sensational opportunity. So what will happen if it's not invalidated and if it sticks is that the human race will sadly overpay for something that someone didn't invent and gets an award of monopoly by attempting to establish they did at the patent office. That would be sad. Okay. Thank you all.